good morning. Thank you for joining us. We are going to have a lot to cover today, and we have three fabulous speakers, presenters from our nonprofit sector to do that. I want to start off, however, by just telling folks a little bit about who we are and what we're doing and why. So most of you here probably have some sense. Many of you are members of Cal Nonprofits, but for those that may be new to us, Cal Nonprofits is the California Association of Nonprofits. We're 41 years old. And we're really three things. We are an advocate working on policy to support the nonprofit sector. We're an educator giving things like webinars as well as in-person presentations all over the state of California about everything that affects the sector. So we deal with a broad cross-section of the things that keep the nonprofit sector strong and how to build that strength over time. And then data and research. We know that it's very difficult to get good data oftentimes in the nonprofit world. And so when we see good data, we push it out, make sure people can access it, share it. In many cases, we actually partner with researchers. That compensation webinar is a good example where we're a partner with the Nonprofit Compensation Associates and Rita Heronian, who will be presenting with us that day. And then in some cases, we run our own research with research teams. And in the case of 2026, we are completing our Causes Count update showing the economic and political power of the nonprofit sector here in California. So we do a lot. Always here as a resource. We encourage you to connect with us in any way you can. And we're grateful that you're here this morning. So let's talk a little bit about why we're doing this. Now, this was something that we planned not that long ago. Looking at the field and sort of the political landscape of where we find ourselves today in 2026, we want to make sure that everyone has access to good information, current information, cut through the noise, and there's a lot of noise, which I'll discuss here in a moment. And we want to talk about the nonprofit sector specifically around elections and what our roles are and are not, as well as offer up some real-time first-hand experience for some fabulous organizers who are out in community doing the kind of voter engagement that we think is so important here in California and beyond. We're going to talk a little bit about the legal context. We never want to go far into political engagement in the nonprofit sector without making sure everyone's really clear on the rules. The good news is there's a lot we can do. Many folks don't understand this or have been miseducated on this, so we constantly are trying to share what's real, what's possible, what the red lines are, and how much there actually is that we can do with respect to elections, voter engagement, etc. Legal compliance, nonprofits is part of that, and of course we want to make sure that folks know that there are rules. We do respect those rules. But it is far more that we can do as 501c3 public charities than many people realize. We're going to talk and hear actually two perspectives of what GO2EV efforts look like, what voter connection looks like, what voting with your mission and values looks like, and then we'll have some time for a conversation. So that's really what we're going to do today, and we're looking forward to that. So let me start by just sharing a few of the basics of where we find ourselves in 2026. So the good news is this. Our Secretary of State, her office, Dr. Shirley Weber's office, has been very forward on what it is to vote in California. They have been advocates for expanding voting rights and expanding the franchise, if you will. So California has been a leader for many years in trying to make sure that every citizen here who has the right to vote, can vote, will get the access to the voting booth or ballot. I know voting booth sounds like an old-timey term these days, since we all get them in the mail. But the good news is that has long been a value here in California. And despite the messages coming out of Washington, D.C., we want to make sure everyone knows that the rules actually have not changed. What you can do here in California with respect to accessing the vote has not changed since the last election or the one before. And the team there at the Secretary of State's office have been very clear about that. So if you haven't already, I would encourage you to take a look at their website. They have very clear, straightforward information about every election. And of course, we have the June 2nd primary coming up. This is the week that ballots went out. In fact, I got mine last night, yesterday. It arrived in my mailbox. Many people at this point in this week already have them. They began mailing on the 4th at the beginning of this week. In fact, I even heard of some folks that got them over the weekend, last weekend. And so those ballots are out. We have a wild, open gubernatorial race this year, and I know a lot of folks are sitting and waiting to see what happens next on that. So the good news is you can vote anytime between now and Election Day. and the rules about how to make sure that that ballot is postmarked or walk it into one of those secure ballot boxes. Those have been open since the beginning of this week. So the target date to open ballot boxes, drop boxes all over the state was the 5th of May. And the in-person for all the Voters' Choice Act counties, those centers open on May 23rd this year. So again, all this information is up on the Secretary of State's website. And you can find more of that if you, depending on where you live in California. It does vary county to county. Now that's the thing to remember. County, in the US, of course, states are charged with running elections, and in California, most of that specific, the dynamics of how elections work are made at the local county level. So the Secretary of State's office does run the election statewide, but they defer a lot to counties because, of course, what it looks like in a sparsely populated rural part of the state versus a densely populated urban part of the state or a suburban part of the state can be very different. So just know that all of those rules and regs are up and available, and we'll drop that into the chat periodically throughout this session. And we just want to make sure people realize that that is the go-to place for that, as well as your county clerk, recorder, assessor, which in California is an elected position as well. So I want to say two things before I bring on the panel introductions. One is that nonprofits absolutely can and should be engaged in policy work. We are big advocates for that. We are advocates ourselves. We are currently sponsoring 6 bills in the state legislature. So we think that it's very important that those discussions are led by nonprofits. Could you imagine what our public policy would look like if, in fact, any issue, whether we're talking domestic violence, gender equality, climate issues, we're talking about access to healthy foods, childcare, whatever the issue is, if the folks on the ground doing the work in nonprofits were actually leading those discussions. That's the goal. That's the big picture as we try to build power across the state for the nonprofit sector. So in that spirit, elections are just part of that. So policy and budget setting is something we all should be engaged in. There are, of course, rules about that. But people misunderstand. Elections are not off the table. In fact, nonprofit 501c3s can endorse ballot initiatives if they so choose. There are different things you can do. The one big red line is we cannot be partisan actors. So we may not endorse candidates, we may not fund candidates, we may not oppose candidates or parties. But everything short of that is potentially within our realm as a 501c3 public charity. And of course, if you're a 501c4, you have even more room to work. So we're going to hear more about that, but we just want to make sure everyone knows there are rules on how you have to do that, and there are reporting requirements. But in fact, if anyone says, well, you can't be political, we're the first to stand up and say that is false. We absolutely can be engaged in politics and policy. We just cannot be partisan actors. So one of the things we've done at Cal Nonprofits for many years is something we call Vote With Your Mission. It was an active campaign when we launched it about a decade ago. It's now more something that lives on the website at the moment. But the idea is simply, can you imagine if everyone involved in the nonprofit sector, and in California, we're actually the 3rd largest employer. So just people that work in the sector make up almost 1.5 million Californians. And many times that are volunteers for nonprofits. And if you think of all the values that people bring to that nonprofit community work, think about bringing those values to the ballot box. So we'll never tell anyone how to vote, except for maybe endorsing a ballot initiative here and there. But we will, in fact, say we want everyone to vote, and we want to bring all those values and all that work that we do every day to the ballot box. So you're going to hear various perspectives on that. And let's go ahead and bring up the slide for our panelists today. All right, we have 3 speakers, and you see them there in order. You will hear from them. So Sarah Efthimiou is the Senior Counsel with Boulder Advocacy and the Alliance for Justice. She is someone who we lean on heavily here. If you don't know AFJ and Boulder Advocacy, they are our go-tos when it comes to the rules of the road with respect to political engagement, and she's going to share a bit in a moment. Skye Allen, who is the Executive Director of the Inland Empire United Education Fund, the IE. I had the pleasure of sitting with Skye on a panel not all that long ago at SoCal Grantmakers Policy Conference. Incredible work engaging voters and community members. And last but certainly not least, Luz Gallegos, who's the Executive Director at TODEC, who also does some fabulous work in community engagement, voter engagement, and education. Will give a perspective on what it means and what it looks like today. And we want to also hear about what are people hearing from the doors they knock on and from the communities they gather with. So with no further ado, I'm going to bring Sarah up and hand over the mic and say thank you very much. Sarah, it's all yours.
Thank you for that introduction, Jeff, and welcome everybody to the webinar today. I'll just add to Jeff's introduction that I am zooming in from Orange County, California. Okay, so just sharing my slide deck here so everyone can see where we are. All right. So, following on from Jeff's statements about what 501c3s can do, which absolutely we can do a lot, I am going to spend the next 20 minutes or so going through some of those rules that he highlighted. Okay, so specifically, we're going to take a look at how legal rules may impact your work around the and leading up to the June 2nd primary. So, specifically, I'm going to be discussing how the IRS federal tax rules apply to 501c3 public charities. So, certainly, there are a multitude of other types of nonprofits that have different rules and different abilities, but our focus is really going to be on the C3 public charity. And then one more thing before we get into the substance today, it's also important to be aware that there are other rules at both the federal and state level, even local level potentially, that could impact your voter engagement activities. So I wanted to highlight that while we're really focusing in on IRS rules, just be aware that there may be other, regulations and laws that also apply. So, in interest of time, I'm going to skip the next couple of slides, which introduce Alliance for Justice and Boulder Advocacy. But if you aren't familiar with us, I encourage you to check out our website, afj.org, and really the multitude of resources and information that we have there. Particularly at Boulder Advocacy, we are here to support nonprofits in their advocacy mission and journey, and we have a load of resources available to you, as well as a free technical assistance line that I encourage you to take advantage of. Finally, just a little bit remaining last piece of housekeeping here. Although I am a lawyer and I'll be discussing legal rules today, please note that I'm not providing legal advice. So if you have specific questions about activities or situations that you're dealing with, I encourage you to seek outside legal advice there. All right, so with that, let me give you an overview of what I will be presenting in my short time today. So before I get there, I just wanted to highlight a report that just came out last month from Independent Sector. It's really good. If you haven't seen it yet, I encourage you to take a look. They released a number of polls that they had collected, and one that really stood out to me that impacts what we're talking about today is it has to do with voter engagement. So through their poll, they found that 84% of Americans agreed that nonprofits, and I'm thinking here that C3 specifically should be helping people and their communities understand their rights as voters. So we very much, have the backs and the consensus of the public in the work that we're doing. So I'm going to start out by just a refresher, reminding you, taking another look at what are the rules that do apply to 501c3s, particularly around nonpartisanship, how to remain nonpartisan, what that means exactly. And then we're going to explore all of those activities that C3s can do around an election season, because as Jeff mentioned, there's so much more we can do as a C3 than we can't do. And then I'll wrap up my section with some practical tools for staying compliant and making sure that you do indeed remain nonpartisan, and then highlight some of our Boulder advocacy resources that particularly pertain to this topic and how you can reach out to us if you have questions after today. So let's get straight into the rules. So while all nonprofits can and should advocate for their missions and communities, the IRS does impose certain rules that C3s need to operate within. So let's take a look at what those look like. So what I have up here is a chart, which if you've attended our Boulder advocacy trainings in the past, this will look very familiar. So you can think about the IRS rules, in a nutshell as a traffic light. So when we're talking about what is prohibited or red light activity, this is where our partisan political work would come in. What is partisan political work? We're going to look into that in more detail, but basically it's supporting, endorsing, or opposing a candidate for public office. That is the single prohibition when it comes to advocacy activities for C3 charities. Now, moving down the traffic light, we have our advocacy tool of lobbying, which again is a critical, important tool for C3s. We're not really going to focus on it today, but know that is something that you could do as part of your policy advocacy. The only caveat there is that you do have certain limitations as a C3 charity. Now, what do we have under the green light? We have an awful lot. And this isn't an exhaustive grouping. There's so much that C3s can do in terms of community organizing, education, both community members and legislators, research, training, litigation. But also in this category of green light, unlimited activity, it's nonpartisan voter education and voter engagement. Okay, this is something we're going to be focusing on today, really critical and very important to get folks in the community out and engaged. So let's focus for a moment on that red light activity, that prohibited partisan political work. So what does the term nonpartisan mean? Well, again, it means that a 501c3 could not support or oppose candidates for public office. Now, that term candidates can sometimes be a little bit confusing. What does it mean? Who is a candidate? Well, it's someone who appears on the ballot for a vote. This could include candidates who are affiliated with a party, or it could also include people running for a quote nonpartisan office. Okay, so this could be someone without a D or an R attached to their name, someone in an independent party, even running for a nonpartisan office, like, for example, many of our county judge positions are nonpartisan. School board positions are often nonpartisan. However, they are still candidates, so a C3 could not endorse or oppose them for office. So the real key there, are they a candidate on the ballot? Now, so looking aside from, well, who are the candidates? How do we determine whether our actions, activities, or communications would be partisan or not? Because sometimes it's going to be very clear. For example, if an organization is endorsing a candidate, that's going to be clearly partisan. If it's merely a social media post saying, the polls open at 8 p.m. or close at 8 p.m. on such and such date, that's purely educational, that's not partisan. However, there's going to be a lot that falls in between in that gray area. So then the question is, well, how do we determine if it's partisan or not? So to determine whether or not an organization has, remained within the nonpartisan realm or in fact violated those nonpartisan rules, the IRS applies what is called a facts and circumstances test. Okay, so they're looking not only at the communication or the activity, but also the surrounding facts and circumstances. So this includes things like, why are you communicating? Who are you communicating to? Who is your audience? And what's the purpose? What is the purpose behind the activity or communication? So because the IRS is going to be applying this test, this is exactly what you should be doing when you are considering whether or not an activity or communication is partisan. How would it look to the IRS looking at the surrounding facts and circumstances? At that point, then it's up to your organization to decide how much risk you're willing to accept. So again, to use that traffic light analogy, just because you see a yellow light, it doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't go through. It just means you need to slow down, proceed with caution, check what else is going on outside of the activity or communication itself. Now, let's take a look at a few concrete examples here. So, because a single statement or a single act can vary a lot based on the surrounding circumstances, this is why the IRS is going to look at both the facts of what happened and what's going on around it. What are the surrounding circumstances in which that occurred? So they would look at, for example, is a candidate specifically referenced? Is the election referenced? Or rather, are you just commenting on a sitting government official who happens to be running, happens to be an incumbent? Other factors could be timing. Okay, so how close was the statement made to the election? Because the timing of when you make a statement can change its meaning a lot. So, was there a legislative vote going on where you were talking about a particular policy issue? Or was it really related to, a particular candidate stance on that policy idea? And then another very important factor here with the facts and circumstances analysis is history. Does your organization have a track record in advocating around a particular area? Or is it something you just came out and said because it's a big issue for a candidate that's up for election, and that candidate happens to support the same policies that your organization supports? And this also leads us to what are considered wedge issues. Okay, you may have heard this term batted around. So, wedge issues are those issues that tend to divide candidates or divide candidates in a particular election. So, why does this matter? Well, if a C3 is supporting one side or the other side of a wedge issue, that could be seen as supporting a particular candidate or a party. So, if one candidate is in support of that issue and your organization is also in support, the question is, well, then are you demonstrating, implicitly that you are also supporting that candidate? Okay, so that doesn't mean that you can never talk about wedge issues, certainly not. It's just as it gets closer to an election, it does get riskier. So this is when you need to consider, do you have a track record in this issue? So for example, if you're talking about reproductive justice, abortion rights, for example, if this is an advocacy area that you have been talking about, is furthering your mission prior to the election, then it's going to be less risky to continue that advocacy right up to the date of the election. Now, just to note, what I have up here on this slide, this is not an exhaustive list by any means. So these are only examples. There are many, many other factors that the IRS would take into account, and which you should as well. So with that, now that we've had our refresher of the rules, let's look at what 501c3s can do during election season. So what are the permissible activities, nonpartisan activities that a C3 could do? Well, up here on this slide, I have a grouping of 4, but because the topic of today's webinar is on getting ready for the June primary, I'm going to focus on the last 2 activities: voter education and voter registration, get out the vote. Okay, but keep in mind, when it comes to policy advocacy, issue advocacy, this is certainly something you can continue through an election season, as well as when it comes to educating candidates about what is important to your communities. Okay, so a great nonpartisan area of advocacy is voter education. Okay, so in addition to informing voters and about the mechanics of voting, so where to vote, when to vote, how to vote, not as in which candidates to vote for, but, what does it mean? How do you show up to the poll if you're voting in person? How is a mail-in ballot completed? How does it need to be sealed? So those mechanics of actual voting. In addition to all of that, 501c3s can educate voters about the folks that they're going to be voting for. Of course, this needs to be done in a nonpartisan manner, okay, to remain C3 permissible. So what are some forms of voter education that a C3 might consider engaging in? Well, one would be putting out information about how sitting government officials have voted. So voting records, legislative scorecards. Okay, so there are a few things here to keep in mind in order to truly stay nonpartisan, to keep this C3 permissible. This should very much be focused on the acts of government officials, so sitting legislators, not the fact that they are candidates, incumbents running for office. So here, of course, as a C3, you wouldn't want to grade these voting records in any way. It's simply factual information that is provided. Now, another form of voter education could come in the context of candidate questionnaires, voter guides. This is something that Cal Nonprofits has done just recently for our California governor's race. Okay, so just like with legislative scorecards and voting records, there are some good practices to keep in mind here with questionnaires too. So you want to keep them unbiased, okay? Give all candidates a chance to answer. Don't edit them in any kind of way to show favor or disfavor for a particular candidate or party. So again, just keeping them very factual. And then a third type of voter education comes in the form of candidate forums, candidate debates. Okay, so just like with the just with like with the candidate questionnaires, to keep them nonpartisan, asking open-ended questions, not editing the responses in any way, inviting all viable candidates. This is really critical here. Now, there is a caveat here. The IRS does permit, if we're talking about a primary race, a C3 could just invite the candidates for that particular primary. But otherwise, once we're talking about the general election, all viable candidates from all parties would need to be invited. And of course, being given an equal opportunity to participate. Now, in addition to candidate debates or forums that you may be holding or you may have held, you may have, a reason to host candidates for another purpose. Okay, so for example, you might invite a candidate to your, annual fundraising gala or for whatever your charitable event you're holding. But if you have invited them because of their candidacy, because they are a candidate running for office, the rules that we just discussed, apply here too. So all candidates should be given an equal opportunity to attend. So if it's attending a town community meeting that you're holding with the folks that you ordinarily speak with, okay, if one comes to one event, you should have some equal opportunity for the other candidates as well. Now, there could be a reason that you invite a candidate that has nothing to do with their candidacy. Okay, so for example, you may want to invite a sitting government official because they are representing the community that you serve. Okay, or maybe they're an expert in their field or some other kind of famous person. So that's absolutely fine. You can do that. Of course, you should have some guidelines there so they understand that they are not there in a candidate capacity. They're there in some other capacity, that they're not going to be talking about their candidacy. They aren't using it as a way of encouraging people to vote for them or for their parties. Okay, so along that same line of thinking, or that way of approaching candidates, what about we're talking about sitting government officials who are also running for office? We're talking about incumbents here. Now, part of your issue advocacy could include giving praise or even criticizing certain things that government officials have done. So maybe it was a vote, like the example here I have up on the slide, where we see Cal nonprofits thanking a legislating legislator for help for that particular push on the bill. So this again, if it's focused on the issue and it's not focused on the candidate, then that's going to generally be nonpartisan advocacy. So again, C3 permissible here. There are some guardrails to keep in mind. You really want to keep your focus on the official actions as opposed to the candidacy. This is an area where having a track record in a particular advocacy area is going to show nonpartisanship. Okay, so you know, getting it back to your mission and what you're advocating for. And also timing here is going to be important. So if the thanks or the criticism should really come out very soon or coincide very much with the legislative action. Okay, so thanking a legislator for an action, for a vote that they did 6 months ago, right before the election, that's going to be highly risky. Okay, what about fact checking? Okay, because there may be instances where you feel the need, your organization, to comment on statements that were made by a candidate or a political party. Okay, so we're not talking here about sitting government officials say, well, this is an area where, there's some risk involved. It could still be nonpartisan then, though, and it could be very important to still do. So, first of all, you need to have a good non-election related reason for responding to a misstatement, say. So fact checking. If it's relevant to your organization's mission and you have a legitimate reason, you can do so in a nonpartisan manner. So in this case, you really want to focus on what was said rather than who had said it. And if you can avoid mentioning or identifying the person by name, all the better. So, for example, if you want to, if you need to correct a misstatement that was made by a candidate, you could say something like, it was said that XYZ, this is not accurate. Here are the correct facts. Okay, so keep it simple, keep it focused on what was said rather than who said it. And a great way to do this would be put out contrary messaging. In some instances, it's better not to give oxygen to misstatements. So you don't even necessarily need to acknowledge that what was said. You can just respond with true information that supports your mission or supports that voter engagement. So if you hear, a candidate or a party giving incorrect information about, voter ID, where people can vote, how they can vote, you don't necessarily need to identify that wrong information. Simply provide the corrected information there. Again, keeping it nonpartisan, focusing on what was said. Now, another form of voter engagement, so in addition to educating voters about the voting process and who the candidates are, all those things we just talked about, 501c3s also have an essential role in getting folks registered and out to vote. Now, voter registration drives are a great opportunity to, help people in the community get registered. If they already are registered, GOTV efforts are a great way to get them to actually show up and vote. Again, these are permissible activities for C3s if they remain nonpartisan. So let's consider again, what are some best practices here? So, making sure that if you are hosting a voter registration event or you're helping people get registered, make sure that your services are available to everyone, not just folks that you think will vote a certain way or for a certain party or a candidate. And then this is an area where if you're involved in voter registration, check out federal and state election laws that also may apply to your work. Here, this voter registration GOTV is generally not a place to mix issue advocacy. There are some exceptions when it comes to ballot measures advocacy, but generally just keep the voter registration and GOTV work focused on that. Of course, what you shouldn't be doing is encouraging or suggesting people to vote for a certain candidate or party. Don't coordinate your voter registration GOTV with a candidate or a party. And of course, don't give anything in exchange for a voter registration. Just a couple of examples here of what would be, an impermissible voter registration communication for a C3. That would be any kind of indication that supporting a party. Here, we see the reason this one on the left is under a red light is because there is a little elephant symbol there, of course, indicating support for a party. Whereas the example on the right hand of the slide here, this is purely factual information about dates. There's a link to online voter registration. This is a good example of what would be a permissible C3 voter engagement post. Okay, what I want to cover next before we get to our final best practices section is what happens if you're doing all of the work to keep your community informed, but you're still hearing about misinformation, disinformation, even malinformation about voting? What can you do as a 501c3 to respond? Well, first of all, what's the downfall of this? Well, it reduces turnout, voters are confused, mass misinformation is distributed, it's spread, And it also just chills participation. Okay, it really chills that the democracy, furthering democracy. So what can you do? Well, you can push forward that correct information. So just like responding to misstatements made by candidates or parties, this is also the case when that misinformation comes from other sources. Here, the recommendation is to share official resources. So Jeff was talking about the resources that are provided by the Secretary of State's office. Okay, rely on those. They even have a tip line we discovered. So if you see a misleading post, they're asking you to report it. It's important to react quickly. So if you see that misinformation and you hear about it, don't sit on it. Okay, especially if we're facing quick deadlines here. And also think about who can help you push the correct information forward. We're going to hear some examples next from my fellow panelists who are, I'm sure, going to give terrific information about, who is listening, who in your community, who are your community partners, who are your trusted messengers. Rely on them. And finally, I just want to wrap up with some, what are some ways that you can still do this important work and ensure that you remain compliant? Okay, what I have up here on the slide are just some, tips, some recaps here. So again, in your messaging around getting folks out to vote and voter information about candidates, really center on the issues as opposed to individual candidates, right? Um, Praising, criticizing sitting government officials, great. Avoiding praise and criticism of candidates, that is going to keep you nonpartisan. Um, of course, of course, we talked about fact checking already. So if the misinformation is coming from a candidate or a party, focus on what was said. Don't talk about the candidates that said it. Again, avoid criticizing candidates. And then responding timely with correct information wherever that misinformation is coming from. We already talked about risk assessment. Okay, carefully, if you are unsure, if you're operating in those gray areas, do that risk assessment. Think about the surrounding facts and circumstances, and then decide what your risk tolerance level is as an organization, and then make the decision. Do you continue with the activity? Do you need to modify it somehow? Do you need to change the language of that social media post? Or are you in a situation where you are not the best organization to engage in that activity? Is it better for another C3 or even a C4 to do that work? And then finally, I wanted to leave you just with some of our Boulder advocacy resources. We have a fantastic desk reference called Rules of the Game, goes through all of these rules and more. Encourage you to take a look at that. We also have a podcast where we handle a new advocacy topic every couple weeks. We just did one on candidate appearances, so I encourage you again, check out our podcast. And then if you have those California specific questions, we have a guide that is specifically aimed at getting voters out and engaged in California. So just a few of our resources I recommend you check out. And I will leave you with you will have a copy of the slides, so you will have information about how to contact us. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And Sky, I think you're up next.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was so incredible and helpful. Um, I lead a civic engagement organization, and we are signed up for Boulder advocacy trainings all of the time, because they just do incredible work and they're so helpful. I want to thank everybody for being on this call today, for allowing me a couple minutes to share some of our perspectives, and for being thoughtful about what civic engagement looks like in this moment, right? I want to acknowledge that 2026 makes 250 years of us practicing this American experiment of democracy. And that's very exciting. If you believe in that experiment. And it's worth noting that there is real debate right now across our country, of if we backed the right horse and if this is something we want to continue pursuing. And I think it's important that we name that, right? Do we believe as a country that all men are created equal, regardless of gender, race, place, or party? Do we believe that we're all guaranteed certain inalienable rights that should be protected in advance? Do we still believe that government should be run of, for, and by the people? I don't think that debate is disconnected from what we do as nonprofits. I actually think nonprofits exist because we believe in that, right? Our role is to serve the public good, is to empower community voice, is to honor those rights and help people access them and or expand them. I think that not only can we encourage people to participate in democracy and vote and speak to the representatives and all of those things, I think it is so important that we do that work, that we should be inviting people and being that bridge and creating an on-ramp for people to see that as something within their power and something that they want to do because we are nonpartisan. We are more trusted by the community because we're not getting into the partisan back and forth. We're not talking about candidates. We're not engaging in that debate, but we are saying we respect you, we respect your voice, and we want to ensure that you have the tools, that you're aware of the tools that you have at your reach to express your voice and say what you believe and participate in this discussion because democracy doesn't work if we don't hear from everybody, right? That is so powerful. And in this moment where people are struggling as much as they are and they're turning to our institutions to help access healthcare, to help figure out their housing resources, and et cetera, for all the different issues that we cover, that we also remind them that these are tools and resources that they can access as well. And there are so many ways that we can do that and we can be that bridge and that on-ramp without ever touching the partisan back and forth. If you're really aggressive and interested in this, as we are at United Education Fund, our coalition, we've got 10 different nonprofits that are out, maybe not right this second, but later on today, um, canvassing communities, going door to door, sending text messages saying, "Hey, you should have a ballot in your mailbox. Election day is June 2nd. And make sure your voice is heard and that you participate." We are fully within our rights to do that work, and at our coalition, we do that every single election cycle to ensure that people participate and that they're getting involved. But that is time intensive and it's resource intensive, and we don't assume that everyone has the capacity to have canvassing teams out in the community on a regular basis, right? But that doesn't mean that you also can't participate in some way. If you have community events, you can notify people of the timelines, of the resources, of any rules that they should know about. Right. A lot of people have questions right now. We're getting questions around, did the SAVE Act pass? Do I need my passport? Right. Clarifying that there's been no laws that have changed how they participate so they can do so in the same way they did last year or in 2024 without hesitation. That voting by mail is still a reliable, safe way to vote, that there's ways to track their ballots, that there's ways to sign them. We've got drop boxes all over the state that they can drop them into if that makes them feel better, or they can deliver it to a vote center or polling location on election day. There's so many tools that people can lean into. California makes it very easy, or we try to make it very easy for people to participate, making sure people know what their options are. If they need support, or, they really want to vote on election day to be part of that cultural experience, or they need to vote at home because they have so much going on and they're not sure that they're going to be free on June 2nd to drop it off. Really clarifying for people in member meetings and emails and social media what those options for them actually look like. You can have flyers distributed, right? There's all of these different tools at our disposal to encourage people. And to clarify that we don't only have elections once every 4 years, but we have them all of the time, at least twice every 2 years. And increasingly in California, we're starting to have them annually, and it's so important that people are heard. Um, so those are just some things that you all can do, some of the things that we do. I'll reiterate that people have a lot of questions right now, and with an opportunity that we have and within our resources to share that voting is safe, voting is secure, voting is accessible. Your vote matters. We really want to hear your voice, regardless of what you have to say. And here's the path to exercising it and making sure that you are heard. And any questions you have that don't touch necessarily on the specific of the candidates with the process, we, as a nonprofit partner, that are here to support you all year round include that important activity as a part of that work and encourage you to stay engaged beyond the elections, and engage in that back and forth with your representatives so that they hear all of the time what you believe in, what you value, what you need. And if you're locally based, having a sense of when those school board, city council, board of supervisor meetings are to educate people about who are the right people to address for certain concerns. That is also super helpful. So I'll stop there in the interest of time, and pass the mic to Luce to share a little bit about what she's hearing specifically around immigration.
Thank you, Sky, and thank you again for inviting me and all our partners here to share a little bit more of our work and the importance of the work that everybody is doing around civic engagement. I do want to share that for our organization, civic engagement is all year round, and it is very layered within Tolvic's immigrant integration programming via community education. And as it relates to GOTB, we do grassroots awareness, and there's different ways that we take on these awareness programming. But in addition, we provide educational sessions so that eligible voters can fully understand and participate with confidence in the electoral process. So they really understand and own their voter bill of rights and power. As a nonpartisan organization, our role is education and awareness. It is important for us to remind all eligible voters to make sure they're researching, that they're using all the tools available, and to really research what's on their ballot. And also utilize their trusted outlets and even their smartphones. Community members have it, so we're constantly reminding them that they have a great tool in their hands, that it's not just for social media or texting, but it's also for researching. And it could be research used for research, to research propositions or research candidates, so they can make informed and educated decisions that are really aligned with their individual priorities and values. And that's something that we, as an organization that serves thousands of community members on an annual basis, we always remind community, make sure that you're researching, that whoever it is that, whichever way that you choose to vote, that you make an informed and educated decision that really aligns with your values and your priorities. As it deals with immigration, the fear of the known and the unknown is and has always been extremely heavy work. It is not the first time, and it will not be the last time when vulnerable and underserved communities will experience these situations that we're currently living. But as an organization, we must continue. And as an organization, we must continue to resist this misinformation and intimidation with education, awareness, and participation. So during these very difficult times for community, we cannot stay on the sidelines. We have to make sure our community knows their rights and also opportunities and also their responsibilities. Our awareness and education and access is very important, because without this, they don't have access to power, especially the community that we serve. we must make sure that community has the most up-to-date information, education, and access, including language access. It is so important for our organizations, especially for our rural communities like the rural and the desert communities of our inland region, that many of these communities have a digital divide, lack access, not only to tech, but also to transportation and so many other situations that our community encounters. And we continue to be the bridge, to create awareness, provide information, education, and access to these communities that we serve. Our approach has always been to meet community where they're at, creating a pipeline of community education and awareness that comes directly from our county and state agencies that are administering and managing the electoral process, like our county's register of voters or the Secretary of State is so important, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that the most up-to-date and reliable information is coming from those that are administering and managing our electoral systems and processes. What we advise, for many partners, to really think through of the comfort of your organization, but to really, everybody has, organizations have social media. It's a good opportunity to create awareness using content from these responsible and reliable resources, and really just meeting where your organization and where your community is at. These are fabulous tools that exist now that didn't exist many decades ago, really utilizing all these tools and accesses that are channels to reach vulnerable populations. I do want to share that, it's very important to create awareness to all active registered voters that they will automatically be mailed a ballot. You should already be receiving them, as shared earlier, for this 2026 primary election. So, this is important, because it's important that community knows that they will be receiving something in the mail. Just making awareness around that is important, that they don't need to leave the safety of their home. They can vote from their home. And in final, I want to add, which is very important, the culture clash, especially amongst immigrant communities, and how communities see that experience is very layered and is very heavy. And that's why for us, it's very important that community knows that their vote is confidential, and that everyone's priorities are different. And when they vote, they have the opportunity to voice their own priorities and values in a very confidential way. We have to respect everybody's minds. Everybody has a different mind. Everybody has different opportunities. Everybody has different priorities. Everybody has different struggles. And that's why as organizations, we must continue saying your vote is your voice is your vote, and vice versa, because at the end of the day, everybody has the right to express themselves in whichever way they feel comfortable, in whichever way they feel safe, and to really community know that they have rights, that there's a Bill of Rights here in the state of California that protects all registered and eligible voters, that we must protect our constitutional rights at all levels, but especially around elections, that community knows that their voice matters, and that staying on the sidelines is not an option. Thank you again for this opportunity.
All right, thank you so much, Luz. Thank you, Sky. Thank you, Sarah. We're right on time. How often does that happen in a webinar? We've got some time for questions. So I'm going to invite everyone to come back on screen, and we can drop the slide and just have a conversation, hopefully, here. I really appreciate all of the perspectives, the technical information, the on-the-ground, real-time, what are you seeing and doing and hearing. And I guess to start with, I'd love to ask Luz and Sky, probably in particular, what are the biggest misunderstandings? I mean, I hinted at it at the front end, but obviously we're getting messages from the federal government that are doing everything to disincentivize voting for putting up blocks, threatening to, seizing ballots. And of course, you're operating in the Inland Empire where your sheriff did in fact seize 650,000 ballots from the last election. So what are the biggest things you're running into about what folks either are misunderstanding about like what's real? What is that sounding like on the ground today as you speak to people in community, and maybe Sky and then Luz?
Yeah, I would say that there's kind of two directions that folks go in. There are some people that hear that and get angry and more determined to complete their things, because how dare you say that I cannot? But I'd say that for the most part, a lot of the more vulnerable folks in our community, the working class folks, the folks of color, the folks that are struggling more financially, um, often feel defeated by these things and kind of succumb to my vote's not going to count anyways, or they're just going to take it, or what does it matter? And that's why we really do what we do, and we're out in the community and saying, like, absolutely, your voice matters. The fact that there's so much, hullabaloo about you participating or not, just a reiteration of the fact that your voice has so much power. Um, and and it's really important to highlight all of the ways in which people do see their vote impact their daily life. I think because of how national our news cycles are, it's really easy to minimize voting to president. And if you're one of 330 million people in the country, what does your one vote matter? We're not often thinking about your city council district of a couple, depending on the size of your city, a couple hundred, a couple tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. And that vote goes so far, like filling up the potholes, the hours at your library, where the new restaurant is built. Those things are driven by your vote too. And that absolutely affects your day-to-day life. You absolutely have opinions about that and say about that, and voting is part of how you communicate that on a regular basis, in addition to going to, making the calls to your representatives and all of those other things. So kind of connecting that voting is bigger than president or governor, though they are also on the ballot and matter. And that we have these opportunities to vote and engage because your voice matters. And let's not leave power on the table, because we know you have things to say and you have needs. And this is a really important way to communicate that.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sky. Luz, what about you? I mean, I appreciated sort of the outlining. There's the reaction that is, people get fired up when challenged in this way from, threatened, and then there's others that feel like that, it's hopeless. And so that those messages of how this matters. What are you hearing on the ground from folks, Luz, as you do your work? How are these messages affecting people's perceptions?
It's very layered, especially with the population that we serve. And of course, there's that fear of uncertainty. And you must know that immigrants come from different countries when their electoral systems are different. That's why we always refer to culture clash. And for us, it's about education and awareness, staying nonpartisan, making sure that we value everybody's voices. And for us, it's about creating awareness of what really matters is what really matters is to exercise your power, right? Is to exercise your power at the ballot place. Because there's so many situations that are occurring right now with immigrants that we are seeing community that's really engaged to exercise their power. So in addition, and we've learned this through history within the organization, that when these situations occur, it turns on the light, it turns on the spark within our communities that they've known through history that staying silent is not an option, right? And everybody has different priorities, and that's the way we see it. Everybody has different priorities, everybody has different values, and they must exercise the way they wish and they feel safe. And at the end of the day, we tell community, your vote is confidential. Nobody's going to know. It's not like in your countries. We have rights, we have protections within our electoral system, and it's important to continue communicating that to our communities, that now, especially with this primary election, that all Californians that are registered and eligible, they will be receiving that ballot at home. This is amazing, for communities that are fearing even going into the street, regardless of where they're at, sending out their vote by mail. It is a great option, during these difficult times, not just dealing with everything, but also with gas prices and everything. So it's very accommodating. But yeah, just to the question, we are seeing community that's really, really looking forward to expressing themselves, and especially our youngsters, our young adults, and then also, community. We're not seeing that fear us going to vote. We're seeing more that, they learn from history that if staying silent will not change things. It will not uplift their struggles. It will not uplift their priorities.
Great. Thank you. That's encouraging. That's encouraging. I maybe to you, Sarah, you're speaking often to organizers and organizations in the trainings that you do and the resources you offer, which we greatly appreciate. And I'm wondering, are you seeing something in this moment that's different than maybe a year or two ago? Are there particular errors, oversights or misunderstandings about rules and what's changed or not changed that you're finding when you go out and do the ongoing support and trainings that you all offer?
Yeah, so we're hearing confusion as well, and from the organizations are hearing confusion in their communities, and it's how to counter it. So we're hearing the recent Supreme Court decision that impacts voting rights. The assumption, well, how does this affect California? And it doesn't overturn Prop 50. We are not in a different position in California. Will it impact other states? Certainly. Will that change the demographic of what Congress looks like? Likely. But as far as, California right now, we have nothing has changed. You know, we're going to see a voter ID ballot measure in November, but for November, we are still where we have been. So, the law hasn't changed there. So but what we're hearing from organizations that we're training and dealing with, how do we counter all of this misinformation? And, just to get back to what I said when I was doing my section, it's responding with that correct information and finding, who's going to be the best messenger. So Sky Luz, you're doing that hard work on the ground, and it is hard work. It's easy to spread misinformation. It's really hard to correct it, but it's absolutely essential.
Well, so let's talk about those messengers. We're looking at a few right now on screen. We've often talked about sort of who can carry the message into communities, and as we've all acknowledged, it depends on who you're talking about and who's trusted in what neighborhood and what space. Can we give a few examples of just encouraging opportunities, or maybe the kinds of messengers people don't think of? Like who's a good ally in this moment to carry and educate and make sure folks know what's real in such a chaotic communications environment? That's for anybody, or I can start calling on people.
Any and everybody, we all have a role to play. As they say, democracy is our civic religion, and anybody can say that it's important. I would say certainly for us groups that do power building on a regular basis, it often feels very natural and organic to fold it into the organizing we're already doing with folks on the ground. But I would say that for direct service providers, it may be a little bit more of a stretch to not feel as organic, but in that way, it's actually even more powerful because it's coming from folks that you trust, that you're already getting resources from, that give you good information that you maybe don't always get access to in other ways. So for them to also validate that voting is important and that you should do so every time, not just in November, but in June too. That can go so far just to have that extra validator from places that you might not expect. I know in our region, we had a really, really powerful alliance across all sectors leading into the 2020 census, where philanthropy, business, academic institutions, direct service providers, organizers, I'm probably forgetting a sector, local government, all of them, we were all talking together. We were all having united front. And because of that, our region overperformed our self-response rates because people were hearing this echoed all across. And that was more powerful than the national fear that people might have gotten around the citizenship question or things like that, because people could hear locally that this was safe, that you could do it, this was how. So I think if we model that on a regular basis with elections, I think more people would feel more comfortable tapping into it, regardless of other circumstances in their life that might push them away from engaging on a regular basis.
Great. Luz or Sarah, any thoughts on sort of maybe unexpected ways and places for people to deliver messages, or who can be those trusted messengers beyond who we might just be thinking of in typical sense?
As shared, at this point, it's everybody's responsibility. It's everybody.
Yeah.
So top down, bottom up, it's everybody's responsibility. That's why we, as an organization, we counter and resist with education and prevention, right? With
Yeah.
having great partners like Boulder Advocacy that we're constantly relying on their education, to not only protect our organization, but also to protect community. So, it's at this point, like I said, it's everybody's responsibility. Civic engagement is part of who we are as Americans. So it's something that we have to um, create that consciousness that it's a culture. It has to be a culture, and that's the way we see it. That we have to be a culture that's generational. That we continue to reinforce that with our kids, with our grandkids, and future generations. So at this point, it's always been everybody's responsibility, and during these times, we see on the ground how people are really looking into history and knowing that their vote is their voice, for themselves,
Yeah.
their families, and for their community.
So how do we? Sorry, go ahead, Sarah. If you were
Oh, I was
going
just
to add
going
to
to
this.
add to both Sky and Luz there. Yeah. Uh, get your youth volunteers and staff engaged because youth will listen to other youth where they don't always listen to older, wiser folks. So keep them engaged if they are there. Yeah, work with them and help them get the message out.
Great. Well, I want to ask one more question, but I do then want to give everybody a chance to just any parting words of wisdom for those with us today. And the question is, how do we get, we've all experienced others being reluctant to get into this work, mostly out of fear or potentially misunderstanding of the rules. Any tricks or strategies that you want to share about how do you bring someone along who you think might be a brilliant, trusted community person, resource leader who just says, I want to stay out of the politics, and bring them into this work? Any either examples of that working well or just tips on how to bring folks along?
I would just plug Boulder Advocacy again and tell people it's not about if you can, it's about how you can. All of us can do something, not just personally, but also professionally in our organizations.
Hmm.
And if you're not sure what that looks like, reach out to Alliance for Justice, watch a Boulder Advocacy training. There are others, but they're kind of the premier ones. So sign up to those, get your questions answered, and then figure out what your path is going to be. Because to Luce's point, we all have a role, and we also all have an opportunity. And this moment more than any, like we're in part of this too. Last year, we were going back and forth about whether our tax statuses or our philanthropic
Yeah.
institutions were under attack too, right? We're not excluded or protected because we're from institutions. We're all a part of this democracy. So we all have a role to fight for it and to ensure that everyone that we serve and that we're in community with also has a say.
Thank you. Any other thoughts?
Yeah,
Yeah. Sure.
and yeah, don't be afraid to operate in the gray either, because we talk a lot about the rules and we present oftentimes black and white, but there's so much rule and there's so much gray in between where important advocacy and engagement can take place. So, if you don't know, the reaction shouldn't be don't do. Find out, work with us, work with your community, folks like Sky and Luz who are in the field, and figure out how you can do the work.
Right. Excellent.
Just, again, become fans of Alliance for Justice, Boulder Advocacy. That's where it's at. Also, count nonprofits, great organizations that are really providing resources, opportunities, and helping all of us nonprofits in our community. So just stay plugged into these two amazing partners and others that are doing great work, we're all working together in different ways to protect our democracy.
Right. Well, thank you. I want to give you all the last word. So we'll do a quick round here. Anything you want to leave folks with as we sign out this morning? This will be recorded. It has been recorded. It will be shared. So the wisdom will live on. But anyone want to offer just a few final thoughts?
One final parting tip I would want to relay is when we're talking about responding to misinformation that's out there, you want to be able to respond timely. So now is a good time if you haven't already done so. Find out where the correct information is, so you'll be able to, Secretary of State's website, trusted voter information, Cal nonprofits, have that on hand and share it with your staff so it can quickly be resolved if a misstatement is made.
Thanks. Luz, any final thoughts?
Yes, thank you again for the opportunity. But at the end of the day, I think it's just reiterating to community again, that their voice matters, and by staying silent. At this point, silence is not an option, and that's the best way to exercise their power during all elections, regardless, local, county, federal, primary. It's important for community to stay vocal, and this is a great way to exercise their democracy.
Great. Thank you. Sky, last word goes to you.
Yeah, I'd say because we close with a call to action, both personally and professionally. If you're here or if you're watching this recording, this is already on your mind. So thank you for your leadership and your advocacy around this work. But you probably know somebody either personally in your life that's unsure about voting or an organizational partner that's not sure how they can get involved. And I would encourage you to pick one or pick both and talk to them about how to make it easier for them. Whether it's sharing the resources that you lean on the institutional perspective for how to make that really compliant and safe for the institution, or to make it fun in your community. Let's have a ballot party, or I'll research this city and you research the county, and then we can come together, share our notes, and fill it out together so that this is less intimidating. But we should all be voting every election and the whole ballot, not just the top, not just the bottom or the propositions, because we get a lot of ads about them, but everything in between. All of these people represent us. All of them should hear from us about what are the things that we care about. And the most important and consistent way to do that is by showing up to vote. So lean into your tools in your community to make sure we all do that.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all three of you, Sarah FMU, Sky Allen, Luz Gallegos. Thank you so much for the work you do, for joining us this morning. As we said, this will be recorded, has been recorded, will live on. We want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. June 2nd is the primary. Let's all make sure we're all there in the ballot box somehow between now and then. And we'll continue to offer more resources and send out a whole bunch of links to everyone here who registered today. So thank you all on behalf of Cal Nonprofits, and we will see you soon.